Hey guys, welcome back to 155 Books. My name is Shannon and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. And rather than doing one single book review, I'm going to be doing an author review of Sally Rooney and the two books that she has released that I have read, which are Conversations with Friends and Normal People. And I'm just going to be talking in general about why I love her as an author and why I adored both of these books. Talking specifically sometimes about one book and then the other, but in general it's just going to be about her story writing, what she writes about, and why I really enjoy her books. I will give you a quick synopsis of each book. So to start off with, I read Conversations with Friends first and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. And this book follows our main character Frances, who's a 21-year-old student in Dublin, and sort of her best friend Bobby, who used to be her girlfriend. And one night when they are doing a sort of spoken word, they get to know a couple, Melissa and Nick. Melissa, I think, is a journalist and Nick is an actor, and they're very beautiful and very rich, and they sort of befriend this couple. And Frances then gets very close to Nick, and it just follows these 4 friends and Frances's sort of relationship with Nick as they get closer. And it's a very simple story, which is what I really liked about this. And then we have got the very well-known and famous Normal People, which has just been turned into a BBC 3 adaptation. And this follows Connell and Marianne, who grow up in the same small town in Ireland, and it's just about their relationship through the years. But it's way more than that, and I love this when I reread it, because the first time I read it I didn't really get the story, but on my reread I picked out way more in the relationship and the storyline and just everything, and I gave this 5 stars. The only sort of trigger warning I can sort of give you for these books that I can think of is sort of emotional abuse. That's all I can really think of at the moment. So as usual with my book reviews, it's going to be similar for this author review. I'm going to go through what I like about the writing, the storylines, and the characters. So kicking off with the writing overall, as the writing is very similar in both Conversations with Friends and Normal People, but what I love about Sally Rooney's writing, and she's definitely like one of my favourite authors now because of it, is that her writing is like, I love its simplicity. It's not overly flowery, it's not overly long and complicated. She writes pretty short books that pack a punch, and it's because in her writing she's very raw and honest, and it can be very uncomfortable at times, but all of those things combined, it just makes the writing amazing. That's all I've really got to say about the writing, because like I said, it's simple, it's short, it packs a punch, and that's kind of what I like in writing by authors. So moving on to the characters. Again, the characters in both books are very complex and very modern, which is something I've only really read in Sally Rooney books. She writes very young, modern, like millennial characters, and I know that might put you off because the word millennial is like battered around like it's a bad thing, but what Sally Rooney does with it, it's perfection. Out of the 2 books specifically, the characters, I didn't particularly like any of the characters in Conversations with Friends, because you could tell that they weren't nice people or not really the kind of people that I would get along with. But across both books, Sally Rooney manages to write these characters in a way that they anger and annoy you to the point where it evokes feeling. And that's like a very hard thing to do, because in most books that I read, I either love the character and that's why I like the book and it evokes feeling in me, but with Sally Rooney's writing and her characters, she evokes different kinds of feelings in you because she writes such complex characters and people, like I said, you don't like. So with all these characters in both books and their different personalities and everything, one minute you're like really angry and then you feel sorry for them and then you'll want to scream at them because you're angry at them. So she's very good at that. And again, in both books, the characters have flaws that, you know, you can relate to and that have parallels to people that you know or things that you've seen in like social situations that you've seen people do that, you know, you pick up on, and in that certain situation you don't like it. But she puts that in a book and it's just so clever. And especially with Conversation with Friends, I saw parallels of myself in Frances, the main character. And I would say, actually, out of all of the books I've read, this is the only character that I can not relate to, but I can see myself in. And like I've already mentioned, I didn't like the characters in this book particularly, especially Frances as well. But I found it kind of easy to say that I could see myself in her. So I feel like the bits maybe I don't like about myself, I could definitely see in her. And it's because Frances does this thing in Conversations with Friends where she holds back her feelings and like what she's feeling, and just keeps it all in and doesn't say what she's feeling because she thinks that she's going to get hurt less in the long run, which obviously isn't true, but I've done that like most of my life. And being in my first relationship, I did find it really difficult, and to the point of like explaining how I was feeling, and I was just making things worse. So reading this book, I was like screaming at Frances, being like, I know you think that pretending like you have no feelings whatsoever makes you think that you can't get hurt, but actually that hurts you more and it causes more upset in the long run. And again, it's something that kind of comes across in Normal People as well, with Marianne. I think she does it sometimes, and myself and Shah were talking about how, especially when you're at university, you girls especially pretend to be, you know, the cool girl that isn't interested in relationships because people like her more. She's like more liked if you're not needy and clingy, if you're just like, oh, I'm cool with whatever you want to do, this is fine. Yeah, you're sleeping with all these people and I'm just here pretending like I'm okay with that because I haven't said how I actually feel. And it's just very refreshing for, I think, young people especially, to see those aspects of society in characters in a modern world, like in books like this that talk about like friendships and relationships so openly and in such a raw way. So that's all I've really got to say about the characters, other than my favourite character out of all of them is probably Connell's mum in Normal People. I've forgotten her name. Lorraine? Love Lorraine. Lorraine is amazing. Moving on. So now I want to move on to the storyline of sort of both books generally, because like I said, Sally Rooney kind of writes about millennials and relationships and things like that, but I'm going to explain why I love both storylines specifically, and then get into what I really liked about Normal People as a storyline, because I would say there's more in Normal People than there is in Conversations with Friends. The storyline in Conversations with Friends is pretty simple, but Normal People, there's a lot more layers to it. But like I've already mentioned, what I love about both of these storylines is it takes a very modern look at modern relationships. So I think in Conversations with Friends, an open relationship is kind of mentioned or is actually featured, which I really liked reading about because, again, it's something modern that you don't really see in books very much at the moment. So reading about that, I was like, this is really cool. And of course, it looks at the age-old, like, communication in relationships is key, but it is very difficult for people sometimes to communicate, and it also looks at maybe why they find that difficult. But both storylines, especially because they're set at university, I have seen parallels in these storylines to things I've actually experienced in real life because I went to university myself, and again, that was very refreshing. And with both of these, I think one of the key things to say about the storylines is that with so little said between the people in these books and the storylines, so much can be felt, and not always in a good way. And I think that just sums up the storylines in Sally Rooney's books perfectly. So those are sort of my thoughts on the storylines in both books generally, but I want to talk a bit more about what I really liked about the storyline in Normal People, as there's a lot more that sort of happens in this book compared to Conversations with Friends. So what I love about the story in Normal People is that there is so much you can take from it if you want to, as there are loads of like hidden layers. Well, that's how I feel anyway. Reading it, there's just so many things that you can like analyse and think about the morals of life and the moral to that story or a very small scene in this book. I could do a whole like 3-hour long video on the storyline in Normal People, so I'm not going to obviously go too in depth about it, but some of the main things that I did take from this is that it shows you that life basically messes you up. So no matter whether you're rich or poor, if you're popular, if you're liked or disliked, things won't always work out the way that you maybe think they would. So you assume that rich people like have the best life ever. That's not necessarily true. You think that being liked and popular will make you happy. That's not necessarily true. And it kind of shows you how and why these things maybe happen and things that can affect people, and that it's just life. But then the moral of the story kind of also is that if you find someone like to work through all of that shit with, that loves you and that you love, then you can be happy. But in the midst of all of that, communication is key. And I've got a full reading vlog of me rereading Normal People, which I will link in the cards and the description box if you want to go and check that out. But I think that is all I've got to say about Sally Rooney and her writing and her amazing books that I have read, and I really hope that she is writing and maybe, you know, drops a book soon, because I would love that. She's definitely going to be an auto-buy author for me from now on, just because I love her writing, I love the story she tells, and I love the characters, even if I don't like them. I love reading about them. I hope you guys enjoyed this sort of different kind of review video. Please let me know in the comments if you like Sally Rooney or if you've read any of her books, and maybe what your thoughts are on her writing and her stories. Thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you soon in another video. Bye!